The Nation of Islam is not a voodoo cult. On November 20th, 1932, Robert Kareem Harris, then a member of the Allah Temple of Islam and a student of Yugon Ali, committed the infamous killing that would damage the Nation of Islam reputation forever. Harris created a makeshift altar in his Dubois Street home, placed a single chair in front of it, and seated his family friend James J. Smith there. It remains unclear what Smith believed he had agreed to. Smith was apparently a former member of the Moorish Science Temple. Harris claimed, "I had been commanded to kill somebody by the gods of Islam," apparently W.D. Farad and Yugon Ali. He told detectives, at first he, meaning James J. Smith, didn't want to be killed. When I showed him that he would be the savior of the world and go to heaven right away, he said all right. Harris also said that Smith later confirmed at the altar that he wanted to be killed. According to Carl Evans, Smith believed that he was being initiated into the Allah Temple of Islam, and Harris had hidden his weapons, a knife and a metal rod, from him. Robert Harris brought 12 members of the temple as witnesses. He attempted to stab Smith in the heart. As Smith tried to get up, Harris beat him to death with a metal rod. The 12 witnesses fled the scene. Robert Harris and his family would later be found by police at one of the witnesses' houses. He was arrested, charged, tried, and found clinically insane. Harris would go to the Michigan State Asylum, and he remained there until his death in 1935. On November 24th, the police would pick up the two most visible leaders of the Allah Temple of Islam. At that time, Master W.D. Farad Muhammad and Yugon Ali. Here you see Detective Snyder and Oscar Berry seated with W.D. Farad as shown in the Detroit Free Press, November 24th, 1932. On the right, you see the Des Moines Tribune photo of the same officers with W.D. Farad and Yugon Ali. You could find these in the newspaper microfilms in your library, or you can find these on newspapers.com. Newspapers everywhere in America were calling this the voodoo cult, over and over again, the Detroit voodoo cult. And the question is it really a voodoo cult? Police were suspicious because in 1929 you had a Benny Evangelista murder. He was an occultist. He was selling potions. He had a basement with paper mache solar system with a sun that would light up with an eye. He had all this, herbal remedies and stuff. And in 1929, he would be found murdered with an axe, beheaded, with his children also murdered in their beds and his wife murdered. They looked at Robert Harris's fingerprints and they determined, based on a bloody fingerprint on the doorknob of Benny Evangelista, that it was not the same murderer, even though they were only about 5 minutes away by car. But W.D. Farad and Yugon Ali were let go. Farad agreed on December 1st to leave the city of Detroit. Of course, he would try to sneak back into Detroit and was arrested for that in May 1933 when Farad left Detroit for good. In 1937, another voodoo, quote-unquote, voodoo murder it almost happened, I should say. You had Verlin McQueen, also known as Verlin Ali, who was also a student of Master Farad Muhammad, who also brought 12 witnesses and tried to boil his children alive in a cauldron. Luckily, police made it there on time. He had threatened to kill his wife as well, and luckily those children survived. The 1934 or 1932 Robert Harris case was the beginning of the end for Farad. It represented a point of no return. Now, remember, he didn't quite lose his gusto for teaching because he would sneak back into Detroit in May 1933, and he would be arrested for preaching in a rented hall in Chicago in 1933 in September. But he had spent most of 1933 away from his Nation of Islam. He was in places like Wisconsin. He was in California. You can find the California thing in Wakil Allah's book. You can also find it in our book. And he also shows up in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon at that time. But basically, he was receding in the background, as also confirmed by the 1938 Beinan article. He was receding in the background, and really Elijah Muhammad had become much more visible in the nation as the minister of Islam and as Elijah Muhammad and not just Elijah Kareem. And As Farad receded in the background, Elijah slowly took the place of the most visible teacher of Islam in Detroit. Now, the question is the Nation of Islam a voodoo cult? In the words of Bainon, quote, the cult received the name voodoo solely because of the cases of human sacrifice. This was in 1938. He didn't attempt to see if there was any relationship between the Nation of Islam and voodooism in Haiti or in West Indian Islands, his words. The cult received the name voodoo because of these cases. But what even is voodoo? Etymologically, voodoo comes from the word for spirit in the Fon language, spoken primarily in Benin, a country in sub-Saharan Africa, west of Nigeria. Voodoo is a broad and hysterical term that can refer to different practices. There's Haitian Vodou, for example, which is a syncretic practice that developed in the colonial period. Of course, Haiti in Central America, next to the Dominican Republic. And it combined some West African spirituality with Roman Catholicism. In Vodou, practitioners interact with Iwa. These are spiritual intermediaries between the creator and humans in a kind of henotheistic model. Though rituals that involve drumming, they do drumming, they do dances, spirit possession, offerings. That's how they communicate with the Iwa. Now, there's Louisiana voodoo. It's a related tradition, but it's technically distinct. It emerged later on in New Orleans, and it blended African, Catholic, and Native American influences, and it's known for charms and healing practices and some dietary practices. Louisiana voodoo was popularized by figures like Marie Laveau, who you could see in the background here, 1881. Now, voodoo in post-Civil War American culture was this kind of hysterical representation of witchcraft and black magic. And specifically after the Civil War, newspapers began sensationalizing voodoo practices that were supposedly common among blacks in the American South. There's a book by Dr. Danielle N. Boaz called Voodoo, The History of a Racial Slur, and it argues that stories about voodoo were used by people who oppose emancipation, right? Because if you're arguing that voodoo is and black magic and witchcraft are popular among blacks, then this would be an argument against freeing the slaves. The media also justified U.S. military involvement in Haiti by exaggerating and fabricating barbaric practices associating them with voodoo. And on July 28, 1932, less than 4 months before the quote voodoo murder, there was actually a movie called White Zombie, which was released, and it was the first feature-length zombie movie. And the movie featured a voodoo master named Murder, who transformed a young woman into a zombie. Was Master Farad Muhammad teaching voodoo? Now, neither Haitian voodoo nor Louisiana voodoo traditionally involve human sacrifice anyway. And even voodoo dolls are not derived from Haitian, Louisianian, or West African traditions. Strictly speaking, we don't see any voodoo or voodoo influences in the early Nation of Islam. Farad was a naturalist. He was a materialist. He, did not believe in Iwa. He didn't speak on possession. His teachings don't really demonstrate any kind of West African or any kind of African influences. Farad did teach diet, but his diet didn't include any kind of charms, nor did it include any kind of ritual practices related to spirits. So accusations of voodoo seem to have been colored by a moral panic in Detroit. And that moral panic was in Detroit specifically because of the Beni Evangelista murder. Again, he also wasn't a practitioner of voodoo. He was an occultist, though. And he has a book, which is very bizarre, and you can find it online. But it was also this moral panic in America broadly. When 1932 voodoo murder happened, W.D. Farad was being referred to in the newspapers as an Oriental fakir. And fakir in Arabic means a poor person, but fakir in those days in the American press meant a con man. It meant like a magician or a fortune tellers. Now, these labels may have been applied to Farad because he was a foreigner. He was this Eastern man leading what looked like an occult group, and it was a group of black people, so the name voodoo stuck. So how should we classify the so-called voodoo murder? It wasn't voodoo, but it was a ritual murder performed by an insane person. Robert Harris did go to an asylum. He wasn't a leader of the Nation of Islam, so we can't take his actions as a kind of cogent representation of W.D. Farad's teachings or Elijah Muhammad's teachings or anyone's teachings. He was insane. Over here on the left, you have a picture of his very crowded arraignment. People were very interested in this case. But we have to admit that there are violent elements to the teachings of the Nation of Islam. In particular, the most famous part in the Supreme Wisdom is this 10th degree, which talks about the bringing of four devils. In earlier pre-canonical versions of that, it actually says bringing the heads. Each Muslim is required to bring the heads of four devils. Now, that teaching would be tempered after the so-called voodoo murder. Here you have Hatem Sahib's 1951 thesis, which says, quote, W.D. Farad, this is quoting Elijah Muhammad, W.D. Farad did teach us that if everyone kills four devils at the proper time, he will have free transportation to Mecca. This teaching had stirred the police department in Detroit against him. Ever since they began to persecute us, ever since they began to persecute us and charge us with various charges. Now, the footnote here says his disciple, from the same article, thesis. His disciple, Mr. Elijah Muhammad, told the writer that Farad himself does not believe in this teaching, but he taught it in order to take fear of the white man out of his followers. This last quotation is what Farad himself told Elijah Muhammad after his declaration of the rule. In Michael Muhammad Knight's book, The Supreme Wisdom Lessons, this on the right over here, he writes the following. Throughout nation tradition, the degree has been interpreted allegorically. In 1951, a nation members confiscated materials identified four devils as dangers to avoid: Caucasian, drinking, smoking, and pork. That's found in the FBI file. And then there's also a 1954 FOI meeting with Captain Joseph X, and he interpreted the taking of devils' heads to mean bringing new members into the nation. In other words, bringing four converts, because bringing a black man the knowledge of himself was like cutting off the head of a devil. We also know in general that there is violence in the Nation of Islam. It doesn't have to be ritualized, but we do know that Farad, for example, threatened to kill all of white people. We know that outside of this 10th degree, and we have to say regarding this 10th degree that there were like, I mean, the Harris thing and the McQueen thing, the fact that you're bringing 12 witnesses to, I guess, like kind of like 12 disciples or 12 scientists to witness this ritual murder, that kind of template has to come from somewhere. And I do have in my article on Freemasonry on the Berkeley Institute for Islamic Studies a theory on where that comes from. And it's basically a Shriner initiation ritual. But besides all of that ritual stuff, Farad did teach that Asiatic people would kill the white man and kill everybody in America except for the nation. Farad once told Elijah Muhammad, and you can find this in the Japanese interview, that he would gather all the Americans living in Asia, Africa, and the islands of the sea, bring them to America, and then kill them within 12 hours. Farad reportedly told Elijah Muhammad that between a Christian and a Hindu, one should kill the Hindu first, quote unquote. In 1972, Louis Farrakhan, then the national representative of Elijah Muhammad when he was still active, said that Elijah Muhammad said that Master Farad told him, quote, don't let one of these kinds of people, astrologers, soothsayers, and whatnot, exist on the planet. Kill every one. Remember that when Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam, many Nation of Islam adherents reportedly believed that he was not worthy of death, or that he was worthy of death, including Minister Farrakhan in the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And the most disturbing case to me personally was the killing of the naysayers in the 1973 Hamas Abdul Khalis family, where it wasn't just adults that were killed, but also children and babies and newborns. In conclusion, while the voodoo murder and early Nation of Islam likely had nothing to do with voodoo, and while there appears to be no connection between the Evangelista case and the Harris case, W.D. Farad's attitude towards Caucasians and disbelievers in general may have been implicitly or explicitly violent. Any explicit call to violence would be tempered after 1932, and Elijah Muhammad played a role in not taking the Four Devils instructions literally. Regardless, the so-called voodoo murder proved to be the beginning of the end of W.D. Farad, while also being an important opportunity for Elijah Muhammad and his family, who would, of course, take over the Temple of Islam and become the leaders of the organization until the 1970s. Thank you for watching. You can always pick up my book, W.D. Farad, The Man, Myth, and Mystery Behind the Nation of Islam. There will be a sequel book which will delve more into this voodoo topic coming soon, inshallah. I will announce that when it comes out. And of course, this channel does survive on your donations. I need it to pay for newspaper subscriptions and for books. And to create, putting together content like this does take a lot of work. So I would appreciate any kind of support. And you can always trust me to bring the receipts. And as always, I bid you all farewell. Assalamu alaikum.